Welcome back, everyone. If you haven't, if you could take your seats and we'll get underway. My name's Jared Ball. I'm the Chief Economist at CEDA, and I have to say it's a great pleasure to facilitate this session on the policy outlook. Now, I think we've heard this morning that the economic backdrop to policy making has fundamentally changed in the last 12 months. We've got an unemployment rate down from 5.9% to 4.2%. It looks like interest rates are no longer in this holding pattern until 2024, as had been envisaged earlier in the year. And of course, vaccines and rapid testing have ushered in a new regime of dealing with COVID-19. Now, an optimist, as I like to be on policy, would suggest that this should give policymakers renewed impetus to focus on the indicators that aren't moving as quickly, like our languishing productivity performance, as we've heard this morning, our transition to net zero, our preparedness for an ageing population, having the tax system and the caring workforce that's necessary to deal with that changed demographic profile, and of course addressing chronic skills shortages in many areas, not to mention stubborn rates of poverty. Richard Yetsenga actually put this really well in his chapter, and I'm looking at him at the back of the room, so hopefully I'm not taking him out of context with this. But there's a few lines in there, and he says, "This pandemic has focused societies on the most manifest near-term objectives, human health and safety. As the policy punch bowl is being drained, dormant structural issues are likely to rise. 2022 will see them at the fore." And I don't want to torture the policy punch bowl analogy too much, but I have to say that if I found myself at a party standing around the policy punch bowl, then I'd be pretty happy to see the panel that we've got with us today to talk about these policy issues. So if I can welcome the panel to the stage, we have Sonia Arakel, who's the co-founder of Think Forward and a policy fellow at the Perth US Asia Institute, and someone who has come from Fortress WA. So I admire that is an extra level of commitment that I think we should be proud of. We've got Dr. Jenny Gordon, former Chief Economist of many places, but most recently the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've got Peter Harris, AO, Advisory Board from Global Infrastructure Partners. He's on the screen, there he appears. And finally, Travis McLeod, the CEO of the Centre for Policy Development, who's going to join us. All right, so a little bit of an opening kind of challenge to this panel to be a little bit focused in terms of our priorities, because we know that this area tends to get out of control in terms of limitless priorities and different things that we think that can be done with policy. But it's clear that something needs to change, both in terms of what policies we prioritise, but also the way in which we make policy, I think. So first question, I'm going to start with you, Peter, because you're on the screen and I don't want you to feel left out, although you do feel very present with us on this large screen in this room, I have to tell you, and I think you might be the only big head, right? You might be the only person who's appearing by themselves. We've had two for some of the other sessions. You've been relatively critical of the way in which COVID-19 has been managed, particularly more recently. What do you think we've got to do in terms of changing our approach to that, but to policy more broadly as we move from pandemic to endemic?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So my background involves crisis management. I've just been chair of the Productivity Commission. I used to run a department responsible for fire and water in Victoria, amongst other things, including the Black Saturday bushfires. So I know a bit about command and control activity in crisis, and that's what we've been using as public policy design for the last, well, it'll be 2 years next month. The dominant theme in how public policy is now developed and delivered both state and federally in Australia is this idea of command and control. Public health orders require you to do certain things regardless of your own personal interests, and indifferent to choice, which is what we would have otherwise used as public policy design in most other cases. Historically, we either pay for a new service through fiscal means, or we change a law, but it's a law you've grown up with and therefore you're recognising it, but there's a new penalty for doing something that previously wasn't penalised, something like that. We have a set of incentive systems. We don't use that now in public policy. We haven't for the last 2 years. And whilst you might think, but that's only in health, that's only in the crisis of COVID, the bottom line is we haven't been doing much else for the last 2 years. You mentioned Richard Yetzinger and all the structural policy reforms that we should be undertaking, but we really haven't done that much in the last 2 years. We've been concentrating on the virus, and perhaps that's a reasonable thing to do. But what we've allowed in public policy design is for the thinking of command and control to persist. And although you might say, gee, but we've stopped doing some of those things, we've stopped locking up state borders so that poor buggers who don't hear the radio bulletin and can't get in the car fast enough to get across, they have to camp by the side of the road for a couple of months, or putting people in quarantine hotels where we can spread the disease. Maybe we've stopped doing that, but what we haven't done is stop using command and control, and I can show you that because the government's response to the aged care crisis, most recent crisis, was to send in the army. Now, there's nothing more obvious than command and control if you send in the army. So my argument is we really haven't stopped thinking in a command and control philosophy sense. We have to do this if we're to manage our way back to what I might call a more normalised economy. And we've got to stop politicians believing they can be politically rewarded for banning something that our fellow citizens might want to undertake. In other words, we might want to give them choice. And this whole thematic that politicians like to use, I make no apology for, could equally be characterised as, I have no good reason for doing this, but it's damn popular. So we're supporting populism here with our continued philosophy on command and control. Now, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'm triple vaccinated, I wear a mask wherever I can. I'm quite supportive of the idea that we should have different rules whilst we're managing in a pandemic. But we're going to this well so often now over the last 2 years, the well of supportive public opinion. Every time we go there again with another command and control decision, we see more people exhausted by the previous decisions starting to become uncooperative. We have to recognise this. And so in a panel that's going to talk about public policy in the future, I'd like to suggest that one of the most important themes is how we encourage a return to what I might call incentive-based policy making, which still gives people a choice, rather than policy making which is utterly dependent on command and control.
So Sonia, if I can come to you, Peter's talking about a community that's exhausted from some of the rules and the rule changes and this command and control approach. Do you have a more optimistic take around the opportunity perhaps that exists coming out of COVID and the community's appetite and views around policy change?
I do. I think what's been incredible about how policymakers have responded and our society has responded to the last couple of years is that we have done things as a society that 5 years ago we would have thought is unimaginable. And there's something really special in that. Whether it's intergenerational solidarity we've seen from our young people who have dramatically compromised their lives to look out for their elders, whether it's how we've lent into our federal system and allowed state premiers to lead in the way that suits their particular populace, or whether it's Australian exceptionalism. For better or worse, we've shown that Australia will make its own choices when it comes to policy making in dealing with things like COVID that may not be in step with the rest of the world, but our policymakers are ready to do what's best for Australians. And for me, I think the most important thing for policymakers in the year ahead is that we harness that same courage and that same creativity and apply it to longer-term policy issues. At Think Forward, we're all about tax reform, so that comes top of mind for me. And that means tax reform in the interest of intergenerational fairness, in the spirit of the intergenerational solidarity our young people have shown during the pandemic. Tax reform that reflects the growing role of the states and the potential of the states to play a bigger role in public policy issues in Australia. And of course, tax reform in the pursuit of productivity. So I do have a more optimistic characterisation, and I think that this command and control issue is one that is focused on near-term issues, but the same energy we used in a command and control framework is what might set us up for longer-term policy issues, or at least the energy and innovation is what, that same energy and innovation is what we need to tackle long-term issues like tax reform.
Jenny, you've just finished at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This kind of recent policy experience within the apparatus, what do you think is necessary to get this kind of energy and innovation that Sonia talks about in terms of policy making? Where have we got to kind of shift the way that we make policy in Australia?
If you think about the successful things that Sonia's talking about, it's where, there was a clear objective of what we wanted to achieve, right? So we wanted to look after our older people, and you're able to tell people that that was why we're coming on board. And then you said, what are the set of things, and the state governments were much better than this at the feds, what are the set of things we need to do to make that happen? And so, Peter's couched it in a command control and a get back to old policy making, but old policy making actually wasn't very good. It was getting very, very siloed. It said, it started sort of almost at there's this little problem here, let's bring in a regulation, to deal with it. And so instead, we've got to start policy at the point of view, what are we trying to achieve? And honesty with the Australian public about what's affordable, because what we've got is yes, we can have a roll gold aged care system, yes, we should have an NDIS that's roll gold as well, and we should have free childcare, and we should have, and we go on and on. But what you've got to say is, what do we actually want? Where are our priorities? And get the Australian public involved in actually shaping what those things are. That comes out with tax reform. What do we want a tax system that actually does? And then derive it from there. Because one of our problems is that we then tend to look at everything in a silo. We're dealing with a health problem, and yet we know a health problem is usually diabetes, example. That's a socioeconomic problem. That's a problem of poverty. That's a problem of marginalisation. It's a problem of, regional communities with lack of services. And so we can't look at things in silos anymore. We've got to start saying, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What are all the players and agencies that need to be involved to solve it? Where do they sit? Are they best placed in state government? Should we be looking at a regional solution? For Indigenous issues, we've got to be looking at community solutions, because that's where you'll actually get solutions in place. And so we need to rethink how we actually fundamentally go about doing policy in Australia. And so, yes, then you pick up the sorts of things that Peter is talking about, saying, where can you make it choice? Where can you bring the incentive structures in to do? How do you structure that in a way that allows that to actually take effect? And we've got behavioural economics. We know how to do it. And so that's where we need to go with policy. I don't think we're there yet. I think what the current election is bickering about is, the ways of doing things, but not what we're ultimately trying to achieve and trying to get the Australian public to really vote for what kind of world do they want to live in, with a lot of realism about what is affordable, how much tax they're going to have to pay for that. If you want intergenerational redistribution, if you want to deal with the inequality that we talked a lot about in the first session, then we're going to have to think about policy in that more holistic, complex system thinking way.
All right, Travers, challenge for you. We've heard a few things about how we should change the way that we make policy. What's an area that you would nominate that you would start to sort of see some of these changes, including working across silos, moving out of the command and control kind of focus?
Sure. Well, thank you, Jared. Good morning, I think, everyone, and good to see you, Peter, Jenny, and Sonia. Great to have you from Western Australia as well. Well done. So I'm going to riff off what the panellists have said. So exhaustion, long-term planning and objectives, silos, and having a clear objective. And I'm going to nominate children. I think children and our early childhood system needs to be one of the biggest areas of focus over the coming 12 months and decade. In the last panel, there was a discussion about concerns about labour shortages. Let me just give you a few examples from a couple of weeks ago. So a few weeks ago, 1 in 4 early childhood workers were absent because of COVID. More than 1 in 10 long daycare centres around the country had to seek waivers because they couldn't meet quality standards of educators. Vacancies were double the pre-pandemic levels. Now, over the last sort of 12, 15 months, there's been a group of people working, and Peter's been involved, on what a guarantee, a nationwide guarantee for young children and families could look like, what a roadmap would be to achieve that over the next decade, what it would cost and what the benefits would be, the long-run benefits out to 2045. And it's a very important area because at the moment, 1 in 5 children start school developmentally vulnerable. That goes to 2 in 5 for children that don't have access to early learning. We know that the first 5 years are critical, not just for children, but for families. And so we've proposed a nationwide guarantee. It picks up a number of reforms from parental leave, universal early learning, 2 years of preschool, improvements to maternal and child health, and importantly, a way of helping families and children to navigate those services at the local level. It's exactly the sort of nation-building investment that breaks down the silos and has governments working in partnership with businesses, communities, providers and children. On our analysis, it's a big investment, right? It's a big investment, requires $2 billion of additional investment in the first 12 months, growing to $20 billion of additional investment by 2030, but it's cost neutral by then. And the net benefit by 2045 is about $15 billion a year. Now, why do I think children are important? Peter mentioned the exhaustion. We've seen in the care and education, health, aged care, disability, all of the sectors that are essential services that have been propping up our society over the last 2 years have been under monumental strain. They're exhausted. But they're symptomatic of a service system that is fracturing at the seams. And we've been asking Australians what they think about the role of government in service delivery over the last 5 years. And 90% of Australians now think it's important for government to retain the capability and skills to deliver services directly instead of always outsourcing them or working in partnership with others. And so I think working on what Australia can do to be the best place to be a child and raise one is one of those exciting areas of focus that can unite many parts of the country. And the great thing is that lots of governments are interested in these reforms. So we saw last week the New South Wales Treasurer Matt Keane announce a panel chaired by our Deputy Chair Sam Mostyn and Leslie Lobel, who's chairing our Early Childhood Development Council, to look at opportunities for women and opportunities to reform the early childhood sector. And I think it's those sorts of investments, those sorts of examples, Jared, that bring together a lot of the themes that the panel have mentioned.
Thanks, Travers. Reminder to everyone to jump on Pigeonhole, ceda.pigeonhole.at with the code EPO 2022. There are some questions coming in, but please keep bringing them in. Sonia, I want to come back to tax. This has obviously been in the media in the last couple of days, a push around tax reform. Often we see these conversations go straight into tax bases and, economists liking certain tax bases without actually focusing on the objective. So when you talk about tax reform, what do you think the objective of it should be and how that's communicated? And where would you start, given that we've had a number of failed processes that haven't really gone anywhere?
So I think The Economist once described Australia as one of the world's best managers of adversity and one of the worst managers of prosperity, and the problems in the tax system are the best example of that. We have seen the tax system in Australia really leaving young people with a raw deal. And economists have been telling us for decades, and you mentioned in your report, that the reliance on income taxes, a growing ageing population, a shrinking working one, is a recipe for disaster. And what it's resulted in is young people in Australia, young working people, more than ever underwriting the lifestyles of older Australians. And we talked a lot in the previous sessions about household wealth, and I think it's worthwhile to kind of go into some of the numbers behind that and where household wealth has grown. So in the last 15 years, households headed by someone under the age of 35 has barely grown at all. Whereas if you compare that with households headed by someone between the ages of 65 and 75, they were at 1.3 million in assets in 2017, which is $900,000 up from where they were in 2004. From our discussions with previous panelists, we know that in the last 2 years, that would be an even more dramatic change. So tax reform is important to young people because they are noticing, and they are growing increasingly resentful of institutions not reflecting their values. And we saw that last week at the Press Club conference, so brilliantly displayed. And there may not be protests in the streets where young people, around tax reform. There aren't any statement tees yet with catchy slogans, but Think Forward is working on that. There is a growing anger that institutions like our tax system are not setting up young people well. So you've acknowledged that it's not just young people who've noticed this. Ken Henry, Jason Falinsky this week featured in the AFR talking about the need for tax reform. It is inevitable, but I guess the question is, will it further entrench intergenerational inequality, and will it go far enough? To your point about where do we start, I'm not an economist. I could rattle off, stamp duty, negative gearing, franking credits, but I'll leave that to the economists in the room. As a public policy practitioner, we always start with values and principles. And I think that articulation of what we want our tax system to do, whether that's efficiency, simplicity, equity, is the first step. And that's where we start. And at Think Forward, we've been calling for a federal parliamentary inquiry into intergenerational fairness, to ask some of the questions, to articulate the values about what our tax and spending priorities should do to set up the next generation. Because as Travis has said, it's not just children, it's the parents of those children that we need to be setting up for the future and ensuring that family affordability is achievable and that young people, the millennial generation, feel like they can start families.
All right, I want to come to Peter. I don't want to leave you too lonely for too long there on the screen, Peter. We've heard about early childhood. We've heard about tax. These are often things that sit on the kind of productivity to-do list, structural reform. You obviously led the last 5-year productivity review when you were at the Productivity Commission. The government's asked the PC to embark on this endeavour once again. I do note that not much from the 2017 list has actually been implemented. Where would you be going in terms of your priorities in terms of this next report, and perhaps how to implement them?
Well, first off, Jared, I might correct you a little bit when you say not much has been implemented. I think if you look at shifting the dial as a sort of a big bang kind of achievement of the kind that we ran in the 90s, and I worked on some of those in the 90s and the late 80s, yeah, we haven't achieved anything like that. But we said at the time, you won't. We actually said to them, number one priority is kill COAG. I used to call COAG, I did a speech at the PC when I was there, COAG, the place where good policy goes to die. And the reason for that is basically an attempt to get universal agreement amongst contending state premiers and the federal government on something where everybody has a different take on the balance of advantage for their population. So I would say, number one, well, gee, now we've got National Cabinet. Now, some people are very critical of National Cabinet, and reasonably so, because of differences. Yet those differences were always there and will always be there. So the greatest value we can get out of this crisis so far that I can see towards the objectives that are in shifting the dial is if National Cabinet results in New South Wales and Victoria cooperating on public policy design with one or two other jurisdictions, whether it be the national jurisdiction or a couple of other states, you're going to see policy move forward. And we can see that happening in some areas. It's certainly, there's cooperation between those two jurisdictions in health now. There is cooperation amongst them in TAFE, which is an area that's long languished and really needed assistance. So, and that's involving the national government at the TAFE level. So, and these were in shifting the dial. TAFE is in shifting the dial. We were pointing out the lack of effort on apprenticeships and traineeships and the lack of general support that's available to that. So I wouldn't say nothing's happened. I would say we're never going to get a big bang. And it's not just shifting the dial that suffers from that. So did Ken Henry's, magnum opus on tax reform. The idea now that you put a big, complex document in front of people and expect the trade-offs to be sufficiently evident that everyone will go around broadly agreeing, I think is long gone. We can't expect to work that way in the future. But we can hopefully work that way, the way that says, here's the arguments, let's get a sufficiency of interest together and deliver an outcome. And I think we will see that. I think we've sort of seen it in energy. It's surprising. Again, I don't want to speak positively of energy policy, but if you look at it, it's entirely driven by the states. We have institutions that are in need of reform there and are getting it. And we've got a big shift going on and a hands over our eyes worry about what happens with coal-fired power. But broadly speaking, you can see jurisdictions, I think, and the Australian Energy Management Organisation capable of operating in that area. And again, that's an area where you pick up that in carbon pricing. What should the PC do now? Well, in my view, it's got to build on that philosophy which says, please don't aim at trying to get comprehensive agreement across, every jurisdiction in some kind of big bang trade-off of the economic statements of the 90s, because we're not going to get that, and that way lies failure. I think the better approach is still we deliberately focused in shifting the dial on the non-market economy rather than market economy. Not to say that you couldn't do reforms in coastal shipping or in, awards simplification in the industrial relations system or some other forms of privatisation. But the bottom line is the arguments for and against those are very well known. If we've been to that well multiple times and we haven't been successful, maybe we should try drawing from another well. And I think the non-market economy is still the place to focus on because, number one, it's controlled primarily by governments. They either deliver those services or they pay for them. So they're capable of change in that area. They have greater hands-on values. Secondly, it's the fastest growing part of GDP. Health, education, aged care, fastest growing part of GDP. So you get an outsized benefit if you actually fix reforms in those areas. And thirdly, it's highly relevant to people. So one of the hardest things in productivity reform is to take, the secret sauce of the economy, if you like, productivity enhancement, and make it relevant to people. Whereas I think structural reform in those areas of the non-market economy, it's strongly appealing if well managed by the political class because it can deliver better services to people. And Travis has already talked about one of those services today.
Jenny, you've actually, I think, had a crack at quite a complex task of thinking through what some of the productivity impacts are of COVID. When you think about some of those considerations and some of the things that Peter's talking about, what are some of the kind of things that we need to be thinking about now in terms of kind of longer term impacts on productivity, and where would you sort of put your focus?
It's a very, very good question. I mean, they always say don't waste a crisis, but unfortunately some things happen in crisis that actually then, kind of make it harder to actually bring in the kinds of changes and reforms that you want to do. And that's where part of the challenge lies for the policymakers, is how do you sort of move so that you can get back onto what is a productivity agenda. So a classic example of that is if you think about short-term productivity gains, most of it comes from shifting resources out of firms and industries that are pretty unproductive or are sort of sunset into firms and industries that are more productive. And that's one of the challenges. And so one of the reasons we've had slow productivity growth is exactly what Peter has said, is an increasing share of our GDP is in those largely government-funded and, non-market service areas, which inherently are, labour resource intensive. And so the question is, what do you need to do to improve productivity in those sectors is really quite challenging. And it's not just about throwing more money and you get a better quality service. It's actually about a lot of hard thinking about the incentive structures, the sort of thing Peter was talking about earlier about how do you bring choice in so you get better outcomes? How do you bring market disciplines or disciplines from the consumer into those so that people get what they want and they have some control? It's really, really hard, particularly if people don't have a lot of agency. And so we talk about agencies, people's power. It's easy to say in NDIS, well, you now are the consumer, you'll be able to demand a high-quality service, but that's really hard to do. So, we need to rethink a lot of those things about how we do that. So that's the short term. We have to let some firms fail. The other reason we had this sort of low productivity growth was we kept, zombie firms alive. People heard the term zombie firms, and, the OECD did a lot of studies looking at the productivity growth. 5% of firms dominated the productivity growth, and most firms had no productivity growth over the previous decade. And so you can see the issue is that if you don't get the growth, more of those firms in the middle section into high productivity growth, they can't do it because they can't get the labour and capital, then, because we don't let those firms die, we let them limp along. Or sunset industries, we limp them along, we give them subsidies, we keep them alive because God knows we might lose a job here. So, they're the sorts of things that drive productivity growth, but productivity growth, like markets, don't care about equality. They're about optimal allocation of resources. And so to actually get this, the policy must then work out how to deal with the communities that suffer when you bring that in. It's the same with free trade. Free trade is terrific for driving productivity growth. And the more we get global trade, we get scale, really important for productivity growth. We get specialisation. We can attract good quality people and ideas. We get the critical mass we need to get innovation. So trade is really key to driving productivity in the long run, but you have people who are hurt by that. And so it comes back to what I was talking about earlier about policy. You can't think about policy from we want to get trade and we want to, boost this particular industry because it's got a great comparative advantage. We actually have to say, but who gets hurt in that process? How do we make sure there's policies in place that allow those regions and those workers to actually also thrive? What can we do that as a government that does that? So this is this holistic policy making that we need to move to. So drivers of productivity growth, very simple. It's investment in human capital, which is why your childcare stuff is so critical. Australia is failing fundamentally on our education system in many ways. We're leaving lots of people behind. We're reducing the opportunities. We're creating, with a digital economy, we're creating, columns of advantage rather than the old, lots of people get a chance and the really smart, hard-working people rise to the top and end up making, the decisions. Instead, we've got, if you're advantaged, you're in the column, up you go, it's an elevator, and everybody else is struggling out there in the field somewhere, right? We've got to get rid of that. So there's so much we need to do long term to get productivity. Human capital, get trade. Don't let protection, don't let the supply chain vulnerability stuff turn into basically a scheme for firms to not actually bother trying too hard and being able to make money without actually having to be innovative and creative and being challenged. Allow competition to drive the reallocation of resources, and invest in technology, because that's ultimately the thing that really drives that productivity growth. So it's human capital, scale, trade as a means to getting that, and very much about invest in R&D. I've got a vested interest in that, but that's all right.
Thanks, Jenny. I am going to move to some of the questions on Pigeonhole, because they do go to some of these issues that we've been discussing, particularly in health, education and the care sector. and I'll come to you, Travers. There's a question around, we've heard about the impacts of inequality and the lack of movement in award wages despite labour shortages. Should we use policy now to pay the health, education and care sector more?
Yes, I think we should. I mean, they have been indispensable to Australia getting through this pandemic. And I mean, Jenny has just talked about the sort of rise of relative poverty. It's hardest since 2016, I think, for single-parent households. Children in single-dependent households are twice as likely to be in poverty. Older Australians and women have been worst affected. But on wages, I mean, yes. And one of the things we did when we modelled the key components of this guarantee for children and families was to build in a 10% uplift in remuneration for early childhood educators and carers, because they should be paid more and the award rates are too low. And I think that's very important so that we can build, as Peter said earlier, they are the fastest growing areas of the Australian economy, the services sector, the education, health, disability, early childhood. And it's really important we invest in those workforces because they're indispensable to all of us and to the communities that need to prosper for Australia to thrive.
Peter, did you want to weigh in on that one, particularly in the context of...
Just on the idea of paying more, with which I do not disagree. I think it's essential, in fact, to properly reward people on whom we are utterly dependent, and particularly because, you know, they find it so hard to live in these areas, capital cities, where we're expected to provide a service. Prices of housing are so high in capital cities, so we've really got to take greater account, I think, of that. But here's the thing. We need so many people. All we're going to do if we simply raise the wage we pay to people in these very important areas is we're going to force competition for a limited labour pool. We will need to restart migration with a clear and deliberate focus on the need for nursing staff, the need for aged care staff, on the need for people qualified to work in childcare. And that's going to be hard for governments. This goes back to my command and control philosophy, because, of course, the federal government's primary command and control mechanism, other than sending in the army, was shutting borders and withdrawing visas. So we're going to have to restart this. We can't just have the price of labour in these areas going up without realising it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. Just be, you know, if we raise the price in early childcare, we'll see people moving out of aged care. And that's not going to help us. So we've got to increase the labour supply.
Thanks, Peter. Another question here from Meriden Varel. Jenny talked on the importance of policy based on understanding what we want to achieve and then getting necessary actors together. What role in that for the business community, and should it have one? And I might start with you, Sonia. I'm sure this is something you've thought about in the context of the work you do at Think Forward and also tax reform. What role for business in policy process do you think?
We've recently been working with the Business Council of Australia as a part of their outlook document for the year. And it's been really heartwarming to see that Australian businesses care about Australia's young people, because they're the workers, they're their clients, and they're central to the success of our economy. So business has an important role to play in advocating for the kind of tax system, for example, that it wants not just for itself, but for those parts of society that may not have as an influential voice in government. One of the problems with our economic systems, and especially when it comes to tax, is that the tax system has been used as a way to pork barrel the vote of particular sections of society, whether that's wealthy retirees or business voters. And I think business understands the power and influence they have better than anyone, and using that influence to advocate for tax reform in the interest of increasing housing affordability or productivity benefits for that range beyond their own interests is an important part of how they can be a part of the conversation on what an Australia in 2022 looks like.
Thanks, Sonia. I'm just getting the wrap-up signal. So let me have a look at which question we want to take here. There is a plea that we talk about housing and rental and ownership where we're failing, and what the policy response should be. Jenny?
Oh, I get to go first on that tricky one. Thanks. The housing is really challenging. And if in the previous session, we were talking about interest rates and how that sort of plays down, and also the concentration of wealth in particular households who are the ones who are buying the investment properties, who are keeping the housing market prices higher than they would be otherwise, locking young people out of the housing market. So there's a lot you can do, right? Obviously, tax reform can do a lot, but nobody wants to have a big crash in housing value because that will be very destabilising, particularly for people with very large mortgages. And so what you need to do is sort of think about how you unwind it. There's a couple of things in the aged care work that Peter was and I were involved with the Productivity Commission. One of the big things was the family home is exempt from the pension asset test. And so bringing a certain level of value of the family home rather than the total value of the family home would encourage people, older people, instead of living in their big 5-bedroom house, to actually downsize to something more suitable to their age. Helps actually reduce their probability of falling over, helps reduce, hence the burden on hospitals, right? Really sensible policy change. So there's all sorts of lots of things like that when we think about it holistically, that's one thing you can do that works through the system. You could work through the stamp duty is obviously another thing that keeps people out, moving that to land tax. So you can do a lot that starts to move us, and it all has to be gradual and all has to sort of slowly move us towards, getting that sort of change. Obviously, local councils and, infill and, planning rules are also really important on the supply side of housing. So housing, we've got to do whatever we do, we've got to do it well signalled, we've got to have it planned out. The ACT very sensibly is shifting from land stamp duty to land tax over a 10-year period. That's the way we need to do these sorts of reforms. It won't be fast. We don't want it to be fast, but we do want it to be consistent and slow and in the right direction.
Travers, I'm going to give you the last word before we go to the political panel.
You sure you don't want it, Sonia?
No, go for it.
So I just, on housing, I think I just want to go back to Jenny's point about taking that systems non-siloed view. I know CEDA, CBD and others have been looking at our criminal justice systems, right, and the relationship with disadvantage. Now, we've got a huge incarceration rate, one of the highest in the world. Right? The biggest predictor of being there is that you've been there before, you've had a parent in prison. And if you're going in, it's most of you are either homeless or you don't have access to economic and social participation. So looking at how the problems with housing affordability interact with our other service systems, I think, is critical regardless of the outcome at the next election. And I just, the conversation this morning, 4.2% unemployment, the rebound is coming. Just a note of caution on that. The number of people on job active is about 1 million Australians, right? It was 610,000 before the pandemic hit. It's about 1 million Australians. So building more sustainable pathways to economic and social participation, particularly for those who have been on that caseload for more than 2 years, has to be a huge part of what comes next, and housing access is an essential element to doing that well.
Thanks, Travers. I'd like to wrap up the session. If you could join with me in thanking the panel for their insights. I think we've had, I would call it pragmatic realism in a lot of senses about what can be achieved and how we achieve it. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks. Big thanks to Jared and the panel for kind of getting across so many issues in that session. I'm sure there were a lot more that we could have picked up. I can tell you already that I get to do the closeout comments today, and I'm trying to figure out how to draw a thread through everything that we've already talked about, and we haven't even got to the politics, which of course is where we're going next. I'm expecting this to be a pretty interesting and lively conversation. Political outlook for 2022, obviously with a federal election looming and a couple of state elections. I'm pleased to introduce the panel who'll be joining me today, the Honourable Professor Bob Carr, you'll know him well, the former federal Labor Senator and now Industry Professor at UTS, Michelle Grattan, the Chief Political Correspondent at The Conversation, who you got a sneaky look at just for a brief moment on the screen, if you're wondering what she was doing there, Anthony Green, the ABC's Chief Election Analyst, who is known to all of us political junkies, and the Honourable Christopher Pyne, the former federal Liberal Minister and now Chairman of Pyne and Partners. As always, jump on to the iPad or your phone and get into Pigeonhole to ask the questions, and there'll be polls and everything else. So, with no further ado, I'm going to jump over here. Thanks. We're going to bring the panellists up. I can see a few of you at the back. I'm inviting you up, gentlemen. Just any, mini, miny, mo's fine. I'll grab this one if that's all right. Talcum powder. not talcum powder, just, funky water bottles. We're going to jump straight on. There we are. Hi, Michelle. Welcome. It's Michelle. I'm going to kick off with a question that's looming large in the paper today, if anyone's read the Edmund Trust Barometer, which has shown that trust in Australia public trust in Australia has fallen, that trust in government's fallen, and I guess the lead question, if you like, is how important is this concept of trust in determining election results, and in particular the next election result? I might start with you, Michelle, if that's all right.
Thanks very much. Well, I'd make the point first that we have seen a fall in trust over quite a long period, certainly from the 90s and even further back over the years. But what we saw during the earlier days of the pandemic was a rise in trust in terms of institutions and leaders. People turned back to the institutions and to authority figures. Now we're seeing that again coming off, and the authority figures aren't being trusted so much, and there's a lot of speculation that while the pandemic saw incumbent governments favoured, that might be changing too, that incumbency isn't such a positive these days. In terms of the importance of trust, yes, I think it is important, but it's a complex thing, especially in elections, and it depends how the leaders define it, and of course, more importantly, how voters define it. So just to give one example, in 2004, there was a lot of debate immediately pre-election about trust in John Howard. Some more material had emerged about the Children Overboard affair, and people said, well, that just shows you can't trust the Prime Minister. And yet when he announced the election, John Howard ran on trust, and he put that trust in the context of who do you trust to run the the economy, trust in economic management, and of course he did very well in that election. There were other factors too, but people did buy the trust argument in the terms that it was defined. So if we look to the present, we see a whole lot of question marks over Scott Morrison's character, people attacking it from within his own ranks. And so you could say, well, are people going to trust him? But again, he will define trust in terms of economic management and national security.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to ask each of our former politicians. Christopher, perhaps you first. What's your view on this?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, and it doesn't actually behove a simplistic answer. I don't think I've been switched on. There you go. Did anybody hear any of that? Yeah. Good. Because it's a question of how important it is and how much people have already factored in that politicians are people that they don't like. And integrity is clearly important, but are people voting on integrity? And how much do people believe about what they read in the press or see in the media or particularly see on social media? And how much do they discount? And how much have they decided that the whole thing is such a complete mess in terms of social media and the press sort of hating on politicians, which is a national sport, which I don't mind. I mean, I've been in it for 26 years. I'm quite happy about that. I'm not complaining. But does it mean that trust is not nearly as important as we'd like it to be? We'd like to be able to trust our politicians. We'd like to think they're full of integrity, whether it's Anthony Albanese or Scott Morrison. The media amplify the mistakes that politicians make, which is part of their job. The vast majority of politicians are actually doing a good job and trying very hard to do a good job. But I think trust is the decisive factor in every election, but not the integrity of who they're voting for. Otherwise, people like Donald Trump wouldn't have got elected. It's a question of who do they trust to do the things that they think will be good for them in paying for their house, having a job, being free to make decisions that they want to make. As Michelle said, John Howard ran on trust. Who do you trust to run the economy? Who do you trust to keep the country safe? In terms of national security, if there's war in Ukraine, and of course the Indo-Pacific is particularly problematic for us here in Australia, will that advantage the coalition? We have a stronger record on national security, or perceived to have one. So crisis will change that dynamic again. If people are comfortable and happy about national security, the economy's going well, then they'll probably elevate the integrity of who they vote for.
Bob?
Michelle uncannily settles on the 2004 election for this discussion about trust, because I can remember we were coming from a conference in Queensland. I was still Premier, and we had the radio on, and we were hearing Howard announce that Sunday night that the election was going to be held. I remember two things. I remember an edge of nervousness in his voice, and I thought, that just shows, John, that you're human. This was the election where he faced Latham. But he couldn't have shoehorned the noun trust into more sentences than he did in that statement. It would have been impossible. Everything was about, this is a matter of who you trust on this, on that. But it's a question, as Christopher says, of what it means. In November, I remember it was November because it was a Thanksgiving dinner in Sydney. It was a family gathering. My nephew and his wife, who's American, had organised a Thanksgiving dinner, so she was preparing turkey. And there were relatively young people from the tech sector sitting down to the table with their turkey.
What did you have for dessert, Bob?
And the dessert was fantastic. But The American desserts are fantastic. Well, it's pumpkin pie. It's superb.
No, we'll get back on topic.
But I did what I liked doing. I decided I'd turn it into a focus group. So don't sit next to me at lunch at any of these tables. I'll do the same. So I said, we're a focus group. And the results show how complex the question of trust is in the sort of society we live in. Full of cross currents. So there's a woman I would have guessed, I'd guess in her 30s. What media does she read? That's the first question you raise in a focus group. Where do you get your information from? She was a liberal inclined voter. I think she said she never voted anything but liberal. The only paper she read was The Guardian, and she thought that human rights issues trumped everything else. So there's a measure of diversity. And it might be relevant to what happened in Willoughby on the weekend and what might happen in other formerly safe Liberal seats. There was someone who was part of the Anglican congregation in a North Shore community. Any demographer would say that brands him as a Liberal voter. He expressed a contempt for Hillsong. He said you'd be surprised at how many conservative evangelical Anglicans disdain Hillsong, and we don't think he's sincere about his religion.
Hey, Bob, can I just ask a quick question?
Yep.
How many people were at this dinner?
I've got one more example.
Okay, cool.
I've got one more example. The other couple were in a city, Labor versus Green. The thing I most remember about them is they didn't appear to have read a newspaper in their life. So we live on newspapers. We assume people are getting pre-digested news. They're getting it from all over the place. Any assumption you make about how trust is going to be interpreted in this election has got to take account of the extreme diversity of this community and this electorate and its definitions of trust at this time.
So, points really well made. I think what we're hearing is like a lot of ambiguity in all of this. We know from all the past elections that we can't believe the polls either. So, Anthony, we've got some data points from the last weekend. New South Wales by-elections, Bega, Monaro, Willoughby mentioned, obviously looking a little bit closer now. Strathfield. What can we take from these election results?
In terms of the overall two-party battle, I'm not sure there's a lot you can take. Bega was a seat which the Labor Party could always win at some point if it tried. It wouldn't normally try hard at a general election because there's lower hanging fruit than Bega, but at a by-election it was the sort of seat you could win with a good candidate. They got a reasonable swing in Monaro, so you could. Both of those are sort of more normal sort of New South Wales by-elections. Strathfield, there was no particular swing, so it's a bit hard to work out what that means. But Willoughby doesn't have a federal implication in terms of the battle for government, but I think it has a real implication for those seats where there's Liberal members under attack from challenge, because Larissa Penn, who was the independent running there, did not have a lot of resources, only had 2 or 3 weeks to campaign, and yet she's given the Liberal Party a real shake. So how will some of the ones who've got resources, bigger names and longer to campaign go at the federal election? Tim James was much more of a right-wing candidate than the independents are facing in some seats, but it does show that there are problems in some of those seats.
Christopher, you look very keen to jump in on this.
No, I don't really put much store by by-elections. I think Bega has particular circumstances involved with a lot of Canberra public servants, retired public servants moving to that part of town. Much as I love them, they don't necessarily support the coalition. And that's been going on for years. People make decisions in by-elections. The government's been in power for 11 years. And easy to send a message it wasn't going to change the government. The coalition should take lessons from it, but I don't think it portends defeat next year, and it's still good 12 months away. In fact, it's probably good for the government to have a shake 12 months out from an election. I think a lot of voters would have thought that.
Let me ask you a question, just picking up on your comment when you started, just sort of people like to hate on politicians. Where do independents sit in this? Because they're seen as sort of cleanskins, if you like, and coming in and sort of being the anti-politician's politician, aren't they? Is that an issue that's going to play out in the federal election?
Well, I wish I had $1 for every person who says to me this is the election for the independents, because I'd be a much richer man. Every election, there's this view amongst the press that they were going to promote independence, and certain independents get elected, and then they say it's proof positive that they were right. But in fact, they never get as many independents elected as think they're going to get elected, and that the media say are going to get up. A really good case in point is actually the South Australian election in 2018, where Nick Xenophon was polling in front of both Jay Weatherill and Stephen Marshall as the preferred premier. Party polls showed him winning a government in majority in the lower house in his own right. By election day, he didn't win any seats, including his own. He was defeated, and every Xenophon candidate running was defeated, thank goodness. So voters do have a tendency to say that there's a pox on everyone's houses. By the time they get to election day, having had to think about what kind of government they want, they usually vote for one of the major parties.
That's valid, but I don't think you can dismiss Willoughby like that. Larissa Penn virtually had no...
I wasn't talking about Larissa Penn. I was talking generally about independence.
I know, but I'm just drawing out a conclusion from Willoughby that your party would be silly to overlook. She had no campaign. She had no profile. She was a name on the ballot paper, and she got 18% of the vote. I don't think she'll win in the end, but that shows the electorate was, as I said when I spoke about that informal focus group, acutely refined in its judgment of what happens. How do they know that James is from the right wing of the Liberal Party, from the political spectrum? Because they follow politics more closely than politicians have been assuming, and they factored that in.
This is a panel about national elections. And now we're focusing on the Willoughby by-election.
That sends a message. That sends a message.
Which only reminds me that Sydney people think nothing happens outside Sydney.
No, I've got to ring the bell here.
That sends a message about Whitworth, and it sends a message about Goldstein.
What I'll say
Anthony, and then Michelle, I've got a question for you.
I'm not sure Xenophon's an example to compare with. He made the critical mistake of actually being involved in the Premier's debates. So he actually made himself part of the debate about forming government. These independents are rarely doing that. They're usually they campaign on local issues, and they generally win safe seats. They're a much smaller target. They're not dragged into the great debate about forming government. Which
How many independents do you think are going to get elected?
Okay, not as many as some suggest.
All right, so we've got agreement there. Michelle, let's bring this back to some sense of calm.
We're very calm up here.
What do you think are going to be the key issues that play out in this election? I mean, obviously, response to COVID-19, but, you know, here today we've been talking about, wouldn't it be nice if we talked somewhat naively about some long-term economic programs? What's your view on all this?
It's interesting that the Prime Minister has said this isn't a referendum on what's happened, but rather is about the future. So he's trying to move beyond the problems that happened during pandemic management, and whether he will, I think, largely depend on where the pandemic is at campaign time. And what we've seen, of course, over the summer is that things move quickly, so who can predict that with great confidence? But assuming that the pandemic is calm, obviously the government will run hard on economic management. It's ramping up national security. I think, as we've seen in this past fortnight, it's going to concentrate a lot on trying to demolish Anthony Albanese, and it really is taking this to an extreme, in some cases a rather absurd extreme, when it goes back to what he did as a Labor Party official in the 1990s. But nevertheless, I think that it will certainly be very, very heavy on that. As we know, the Labor Party is making itself a small target. It will roll out some potentially attractive policies for the campaign, but I think that it really is depending on people voting against the government. Notably, this is not going to be a campaign about ambitious reform programs. It really is going to be a low-level campaign, if you like to put it that way, because we've seen that really Scott Morrison is not an ambitious reformer, and I think that Anthony Albanese is not going to take the risk of proposing ambitious reform, even if he had a bent to do so, which he probably doesn't anyway.
Christopher, what do you think? What's going to dominate the conversation?
Well, every election in Australia is decided on the economy. Arguably 1966 was decided on the Vietnam War, but I think that's a distant memory for most people, except maybe Anthony Green and a few others who follow elections. I'm not talking about his age, of course, just his profession.
Carbon dating, Anthony.
As a psephologist. So the election will be decided on the economy. There's definitely a feeling that there's an it's time factor in the electorate after 9 years. I think I call them Bob and Nancy Stringbag, the people who basically decide elections.
Sorry, Bob and Nancy?
Bob and Nancy Stringbag.
Okay.
They're basically the suburban voters who decide seats like Western Sydney or Western and Eastern Adelaide or the suburbs of Melbourne, and they're the vast majority of Australian voters because we are the great middle-class country. I think that they will decide what's going to be good for them. There's an it's time factor. They're not in love with the Prime Minister. They're not sure about Anthony Albanese. He will run a small target strategy, which, if the Labor Party can't win with a small target strategy, having had an enormous target strategy at the last election, then they're going to have to start wondering about whether they'll ever form a government, because it would be unusual. They're definitely in the box seat. The coalition is definitely the underdog. I wouldn't underestimate Scott Morrison, nor would I underestimate Anthony Albanese. I think it'll come down to a mathematical state-by-state and seat-by-seat analysis, and that's where it starts to get difficult for Labor unless there's a landslide. And landslides are pretty rare, especially if it's a landslide to Labor. Most of the landslides since Federation have been to the coalition side of politics. So if it's a seat-by-seat and state-by-state analysis, then you can start to piece together a win for the government, especially if Labor loses a seat like Lingiari in the Northern Territory, or a seat in Tasmania, or a seat in New South Wales. It doesn't have to be very many. If every seat that the coalition wins from Labor is two that Labor has to pick up to win the election. So, I think, if I was a betting man, I'd say that Labor is odds on to win, but they wouldn't want to be complacent.
Anthony, I've got a question here for you around the role of Queensland in this election, especially against the backdrop of the minor parties like the United Australia Party, One Nation. Anyone who's been watching the Olympics has seen all that ad campaign already rolling out. How are you seeing those parties play out?
The peculiar... I know what Christopher's talking about with the seat-by-seat. You look at the pendulum and you think, well, how does Labor get into office with those margins? I'm of the view that there's a lot of seats at the last election which are not where they'd normally be for a national vote that we saw at the last election. A seat like Banks, which has been held by Labor for 3 decades, has now been in the Liberal hands for three terms. There was a 5% swing to the coalition last time, which came from nowhere. There are seats like that where Labor just seemed to lose control of the campaign, and where I think all that advertising from Clive Palmer, that blanket advertising, started to bite. So I think there's some seats with some odd-looking margins, and especially in Queensland, because I've 4.5% swing to the coalition in Queensland, but none of it was on first preferences. The Labor vote went down on first preferences, the coalition vote didn't change. There was a big increase in third-party preferences and a much stronger flow of third-party preferences to the coalition than we've ever seen before, from parties like One Nation and the United Australia Party. If Clive Palmer's not out there sort of poisoning the well for Labor as the same way as he did last time, then that may play out differently. There's a lot of things. I think Labor just basically lost control of the campaign last time, and seats blew out in a way. Now, Queensland and WA, the coalition holds 33 of the 45 seats in those two states. They just can't afford to lose any seats in those states. I think there's a really strong chance they're going to lose seats in Western Australia. How many, is debatable. They may lose seats in Queensland. And if they don't have, they've got a 76-seat caucus, 33 of them are from Western Australia and Queensland. It's the highest proportion from those two states, apart from 2010 when the coalition fell just short of majority. It seems that the coalition has to do well in those two states at close elections to win, because the rest of the country isn't quite as strong for them. So we'll see how it unfolds. But I think the messaging will be different from different states. And someone from the Liberal Party said a while back that they think they can win against Anthony Albanese. They're not sure they can win against the state premiers. I think running a campaign against the premiers has started to diminish, except for Western Australia. But it will be a different campaign in each state.
So, Michelle, how do you see Western Australia impacting this election, particularly with borders still closed? A highly popular state premier, although obviously business has responded negatively to the decision on borders. How important is Western Australia from your perspective?
I think it's very important because Labor really does, as has been said, need to pick up seats all around the place, and it must make some impact on these two states that are coalition heartlands. I seem to remember last time we thought, or Labor thought, that Western Australia would yield some pickings for Labor, and it didn't. But nevertheless, I would think that at least a couple of seats surely must be vulnerable there. And the Labor government obviously has been very, very popular. Now maybe there's a bit more questioning of the state government, but nevertheless, Western Australians, I think, have felt generally very happy and comfortable with that government, and you would expect that would at least affect the atmosphere that is there for the Federal Labor Party in its campaigning. It'll be interesting to see when the leaders can get in and campaign in the West. Certainly, I think the Prime Minister has been incredibly frustrated that he can't actually go there. I'm not quite sure whether his presence there would necessarily be such a great help, but certainly he would seem to believe that.
I've got two questions that have come through. They're sort of identifying particular issues or votes, if you like, and what influence they'll play. I'm not going to take them in the order of votes, but I will take both of them. One of them is China. Obviously, a lot of talk about China's national security issues at the moment. Bob, how big a deal is this for the Australian voter?
Well, I've spoken before about how acutely sensitive the electorate is in those focus groups, actually judging the motivation of politicians. What I've been struck when I've been briefed on focus groups is, and they're enormously valuable, it goes back to my time as Premier, is people saying, well, he's saying that or she's saying that because they want us to think X. They're good at assessing the motivations of politicians. Michelle said yesterday the performance of the Prime Minister in the House burdening Albanese as a huge security risk, and not just on foreign affairs, not just to the welfare of the economy, but in not deporting criminals, because he's not backing a piece of legislation that hadn't been thought of a month ago, but was now being unveiled in the Parliament with barely a moment's notice, is just stretching credibility too far. There is no difference on Labor's statements on Hong Kong or Uyghur rights in Western China, or the South China Sea, between the position of the government and that struck by Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, or on the position of nuclear submarines or AUKUS. I challenge anyone to nominate. There's a big statement, or even a modest statement, of difference on these things. And this is the political instinct of Albanese in just settling matters that might be a distraction, especially on national security. My challenge is to the Conservative forces, you nominate where Anthony Albanese or Penny Wong have said something on China or on AUKUS, on Ukraine for that matter, that is at odds with the government's position.
Christopher, is it an issue for Bob and Nancy Stringbag?
Look, I think Bob makes a good point. I agree with him that you won't find any cigarette paper between Labor and Liberal on many of these issues to do with China, or now defence spending, or AUKUS, nuclear-powered submarines, and a lot will be said between now and election day, which will, hopefully be soon forgotten afterwards, because it's about elections, winning the election. I don't think that there will be a fight in the election about China, but the reason the government wants to elevate national security and therefore China and the Indo-Pacific is because the default position of most voters is that probably the coalition is stronger on national security than Labor. Whether that's true or not doesn't actually matter. The perception is if the election's about economic security and national security, and Labor hasn't convinced people that they're more like Hawke and Keating and less like Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, then they won't win on the economy, and they need to neutralise national security. So what the government will do, and I would do it if I was there, is try and raise national security's salience in the electorate, because usually if the elections are about people being concerned about defence, national security, foreign affairs, they will default to the coalition, the Liberal Party are stronger on those issues.
So the other group, or issue if you like, that came up was women, the importance of the women's vote in this election. And Anthony, I'm going to start with you and then actually ask Michelle the question. And the question I was going to ask you, Anthony, that sort of sits alongside of this is, based on your sort of deep knowledge of these things, I mean, how have you got examples where a particular demographic has been singularly important in an election outcome?
Well, it's not so much demographic, but you look at post-war Australian elections, and home buyers in the outer suburbs are one of the biggest demographics that decide elections, and that's just, they're at that point where the intersection between your earnings and your expenditure are most sort of under pressure. In terms of, I mean, there have been some elections where, so for the Chinese community is interesting, during John Howard's period as Prime Minister, there was some disconnect between the Liberal Party and many Australian-born Chinese and Chinese migrants, which the Labor Party was very good at sort of using through that period. And that goes back to the 80s family reunions issues, which came about. So, but they really only affect certain electorates. And the other thing about when you're talking about women's vote, women are half of the electorate, well, more than half of the electorate. So it's a bit hard to, and women's issues vary greatly depending on age. So I think it's a bit hard to sort of draw firm conclusions. But messages you get out there have a different impact on different groups. I just suddenly flashed into my memory was Whinging Wendy in the 1987 federal election. I mean, one of John Singleton's great advertisements. But just also on the trust, it strikes me that on national security they're doing something they did successfully in 2004, which was Labor had adopted a different position on the war in Iraq, and they systematically undermined Mark Latham on whether he was security risk, and trust on foreign affairs then became the angle into trust on handling the economy. I'm just not sure they can do that same thing this time at the moment, because they haven't been able to paint Albanese as untrustworthy on foreign affairs in the same way they did Mark Latham in 2004.
And Latham was being very erratic at the time, whereas Anthony's being very, very careful.
Michelle, did you want to weigh in on either the sort of the importance of national security, how that plays, but also the women's vote?
Well, just on national security, I think that the overall strategy, the overarching strategy of the government here is, in terms of Albanese, give a dog a bad name and try to link all these other things into that. On the women's vote, it's very interesting because there doesn't seem to be any data really on how this is tracking. I think that women are less keen on Scott Morrison than men, but to what extent this really intense debate of the last year translates into people changing votes, or whether, in fact, when it comes to the point, they'll go back to some of these more fundamental issues we've been discussing, and particularly the economy. That just doesn't seem at all clear. We just don't have material on that. One area where possibly it might is that women in the electorates where there are some high-profile female independent candidates, the so-called leafy Liberal seats, they might be more attracted to those candidates than in circumstances where this debate hadn't taken place. But for some women, I think they would see the debate as a bit in the Canberra Beltway. On the other hand, other women would very much relate to the debate insofar as it has gone to issues of domestic violence and the prevalence of that in our society and how you try to deal with that. So policies on that might be pretty important.
I think this is one area where generalisation can be very dangerous. Let's remind ourselves that if a majority of women voters in America in 2016 had backed Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump would not have been president. And they couldn't have had more marked differences about any policy area than attitudes towards women. And the symbolism of things that Trump had done and said, you would have thought would have repelled great blocks of women voters. Hillary, I'm sure, bears this as a grievance to this day. I just wonder, I'm just speculating out loud, how many votes actually shifted from one column to another in party support because of the high-profile protests and declarations in Canberra in recent weeks. I'm just interested again in the diversity of the electorate and the contradictory cross-currents. How many women's votes might have been reassured by Jenny Morrison's performance on 60 Minutes on Sunday night? That might have reached out. You'd need to carefully calibrate public opinion to know where women's votes, if there is such a thing, if it is a useful concept, are trending at this stage in this campaign.
I'm going to change tack because I feel the pressure of the top-rated question just bearing down on me. So I know it's good vote. I know. I'm about to tell you, Christopher. It's a question about disinformation and how this plays out in elections. And I know it's something that's obviously gathered a lot of steam in the US. Different dynamics here, of course, because we've got compulsory voting. But I am interested in all of your thoughts about how this plays. And Anthony, I was sort of watching on social media this sort of AEC coming out and pushing back against a bit of a scare campaign around postal voting. So just, pretty big question, but interested in any thoughts on that and how it plays out in Australia.
I'm not sure it's that influential. I mean, the last two elections have seen this weird social media campaign that you could overturn the election if you cross out all the candidates on the ballot paper, which is just rubbish. And you say it's rubbish, and still people believe it. And some of these things, like this woman who's been on this campaign telling everybody that take your name off for the postal roll so you don't get a postal roll. There is no postal roll. It's, some of this stuff is just rubbish, and you don't know where, I don't think people believe it. I mean, I think what matters, and this really did did matter at the last election. Clive Palmer spent more in the last election than either political party. And I mean, his advertising is the sort of advertising the parties can't afford. You have to target. The parties don't have the money. You have to target your advertising. He just blanketed it. It was like spam. You make your money by getting the 1% responses. All those ads on death taxes and the flooding and all over them, everything's coloured yellow. You knew what it was. My only issue with whether that will work again this time is that if you look at the Queensland votes for Clive Palmer at every election he's run since 2013, he's fallen. He ran anti-vax campaigns in the last Queensland election and got nowhere. So if he's switching to anti-vax and all this sort of sudden conspiracy theories, I'm not sure it will work, and I'm not sure that the sort of people who are going to be influenced by that are necessarily going to be helpful for the coalition in terms of winning the election.
Thoughts from any of the other panellists?
Well, I think I have a great belief in the common sense of the Australian voter, and I think we do get distracted by concerns about things that don't really matter. I mean, if we're talking about disinformation campaigns, really Labor ran the mother of all disinformation campaigns with the idea that we were going to abolish Medicare, which plastered every single polling booth on election day. Of course, we'd never had any intention of abolishing Medicare whatsoever.
I won't bring up death taxes, though.
Or private. Well, we've never run a campaign saying Labor's going to introduce death taxes, but the Greens are in favour of death taxes. So you can make that, you can string that together if you really want to. But in terms of those minor disinformation campaigns that sort of appear on the social media, I don't know how many people really pay a lot of attention to them. Australian voters are really well educated. And one of the reasons they're well educated is because we have compulsory preferential voting. And every election, people have to vote. Now, 2 or 3% refuse to vote and get fined or whatever, but well over 90% of people have to make a choice. And the vast majority of those people make a considered choice. So I think we are blessed with compulsory preferential voting because it means that our system is very stable, but it also means that you can't have like a US campaign or even a UK campaign where mad ideas or mad proposals and disinformation campaigns, become de rigueur, but only 50% of people vote anyway, so they can get the vote out. But here you don't have to get the vote out. So I think it's overstated, the worry about things like that.
Bob's got his notes out.
There's one factor here. It's not about social media. It's about conventional media. We're still waiting for the indication of what way the Murdoch tabloids will go in this campaign. And please spare me the lecture that they don't count, that people don't read them, they're not taken account of. When they get hold of an issue, they can use to belt the leader of the party they do not want to see as Prime Minister. Truth goes out the window. Truth goes out the window. Those front pages become the climate of the campaign. They have a great influence on people in the electronic media, and some of the right-wing talkback radio can best be considered as offshoots or satellites of the Murdoch-owned tabloids. So there'll be a decision made in this campaign as a result of a discussion in a boardroom, a telephone hookup with Rupert, and they will weigh the prospect of a Labor government setting up a Royal Commission into News Corporation. They'll weigh that, but their instinctive position, their default position, will be to absolutely savage Labor, to leave Labor as a bleeding corpse in the gutter. And it'll be very interesting to see how that gets played out.
I've got to give Michelle an opportunity to say anything on disinformation, and then I'm going to give you each one final question with a very brief time frame. Michelle, anything on disinformation?
Well, yes, just one point. Leaving aside the really wacky disinformation, I think one problem in contemporary campaigns is because the campaign moves so quickly with technology and so on, and the media cycle moves so quickly, and we have fewer specialist journalists in particular policy areas, it's much harder these days to get really down into the weeds of policy discussions and work out what's credible, what's right, what's wrong. And that is a limitation, well, certainly for the media, and I think for the information that flows to the public about policy choices.
Okay, I promised one final question for each of you. Christopher and Bob, I've got the same question for you, so we'll see how that plays. But Michelle, what do you think will surprise you during this federal election campaign? Is there something, what would be out of, in your left field expectations?
Well, sitting here today, I can give you a very short answer, and that's the result, because I think at this moment it's a very complex situation, very hard to read, totally dangerous to predict. So I'll be watching that with great interest over the weeks to come and on the night.
You'll notice that I didn't ask anyone to predict the result. I'm not going to ask you to either, because I think I can get that right. Christopher, what would be happening through the campaign to give you confidence that your team's going to get up?
Well, that's a good question. So I always look to the demeanour of the leaders, and in the last election, I thought we would probably lose the election. That's not why I retired, by the way. I'd been there for 26 years, and I was 51. It was time to do something else. But I did think going into the election that we'd probably lose, and it was only in the first week of the 5-week campaign that a journalist from Channel 10 then, Jonathan, I've forgotten his last name, asked Bill Shorten to tell people how much his policies on climate change would cost voters on energy. This is something Bob and Nancy are very interested in, right? And he asked him the same question 4 or 5 or 6 times, to the point where he was kind of banned from ALP press conferences. But Bill couldn't answer that question. And I was watching it, I was in my office and I was watching it on the Sky television or something, which Bob is an avid watcher of, and I thought, if he can't answer that question, he's in big trouble. And he never really did. So he was very angry about being asked the question, so his demeanour was very bad, and that continued throughout the campaign. And if you remember, you probably don't, but Scott asked him a question in one of the leaders' debates, when they got to ask each other a question about a specific small business tax policy, and Bill didn't know that either, and he got very annoyed about it. And it was almost like, Malcolm was a bit similar in 2016. He wanted the election over. He thought he was going to win. We did win, but it was much closer than it should have been. Bill expected to win. He wanted the election over. So I'll be watching to see how, if Scott or Anthony are starting to look slightly shrill or nervous or desperate, because that will give me an indication of how the polling is going behind the scenes about where we are, if we are in front or if the Liberals are in front or behind.
Bob?
I'd be watching during the campaign for some indication, maybe in a state-by-state news poll, that Labor's getting a bit of traction in Queensland, holding only 6 of 29 seats and having such a bad record in lifting the share of seats in Queensland in any election since 2007, Rudd's election, really makes this the challenge for the party. There are hints that Labor's looking at 3 seats, 3 gains. I would think you'd want to know that those gains were pretty certain, or you're likely to pick up another 2 to be able to say Labor could carry another disappointing result in that third of the most numerous states. So I'd be looking for that. Can I just throw in something else, taking up what Christopher said a moment ago? It's not just the mistake a leader can make at a media conference or in a debate. It's the resonance that the media gives that, the interpretation the media plants on it. It's almost as if there's a conference, a consultation of the leading correspondents to say, we heard Biden say that, no, we don't quite think it's a killer mistake, or Trump said that, we're going to go after him with a fury. There's enormous power in how the front pages treat what might be regarded as a mistake or an understandable slip-up committed the day before. It's the media interpretation, which takes me back to my key point. The decision made by News Corporation on how hard to drive its front pages during the campaign will be crucial to the outcome we get.
Thanks, Bob. Anthony, do you think the election's going to be decided on the night?
Oh, look, probably. I mean, I always get this. People say, oh, you know, whether the result is decided on the night is a prediction of whether the result is close or not. Because what you're asking about pre-polls and postals and stuff. If the election is really close, no, we won't know the result on the night. If one side or the other has clearly won on the night, then we can be confident of that. Pre-polls will be counted. Postals won't be more than 15% of the vote. People seem to be overstating the importance of postal voting. I think that I'm going to answer the previous one's questions. I agree with Bob. Watch what Queensland happens. 2, watch can the coalition make Labor the issue, which at the moment they're really struggling to do. And the third thing to watch for is when will Clive Palmer pivot his campaign? If he's running on anti-vax all the way to election day, then I would be worried if I was the coalition, because there's a whole bunch of people out there who are going off all over the place.
Well, thank you for that. Some fantastic insights. I think hopefully you all enjoyed that. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us as well. Please thank the speakers. Pleasure. Gentlemen, I'll just let you jump off the stage. I, of course, have to close our forum, but thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sorry, I will get the mic back. We did have the results from the poll question. What will be the focus on the election? I think maybe we've self-selected into this one a little bit at the Economics and Political Outlook Forum. Economy and jobs at 40%, followed by climate change. Climate change, childcare and aged care, that's a big bundle as well, but economy straight out of the gate. Now, and put this down and jump over here if that's all right. Can anyone tell that I haven't been doing too many of these in-the-room events for a while? It is my responsibility now to try to give you a little bit of a summary of what we've talked about this morning and to try to run a thread through that. I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm sure you all have plenty of things to take away with you. One of the things that that really stood out to me, particularly listening to the session on the domestic economy, was how much uncertainty there is. I used to forecast for my sins of, a long time ago, carbon dating myself, and, usually people would just come up and say, my projection is that the economy is going to grow by 4.275% in the next year, and inflation's going to be this, and wages are going to do that. And I was really struck, and it's not a criticism, I was just really struck by the consistency across all of the panellists around just not really being quite sure. And it just reminded me that this sense of being in uncharted waters is really the sort of prevailing theme. There's obviously a lot of global international uncertainty. We got that tone from the first session this morning, and I think, probably a pessimistic sort of sense of that, if you like, set against the backdrop of what is going to be global recovery, albeit possibly patchy. But then to hear so many, really experienced, informed, experts on the Australian economy sort of grappling with really big questions around, are wages going to take off? Where are interest rates? Is the RBA behind the curve? I think people giving the RBA the benefit of the doubt based on their track record. So I guess that was just the one thing I wanted to call out, is that there still is a tremendous amount of uncertainty as we work through what has been the biggest disruption to our economy and our society in 2 years, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other thing I just wanted to call out was, as a sort of thematic, if you like, was sparked by Peter Harris's comments and this command and control approach. And I think we've all become quite familiar with it. I spoke briefly in my remarks in the first session around the government seemingly sort of wanting to take itself out of people's lives. And we've heard the Prime Minister speak about that in terms of having been so influential in everything we've done, state governments, federal governments, and that now people are maybe just ready to kind of get on with their lives and feel that presence a little bit less. But then when you listen to the conversation across the policy session, that's not what we need governments to do. We don't need governments to vacate the playing field. We don't need governments not to be talking about the big challenges before us, but we do need them to be thinking about it and acting in a different way. And so the way I sort of was summing it up was command and control to collaborate and choice. And that's what I heard really strongly from the policy conversation. A very lively politics conversation. I'm not going to weigh in on that. I think you got some fantastic perspectives on that and a little bit of a history lesson and a little bit of fun and some focus group work. The final comment that I really wanted to make is that you here in the room and you on the live stream have invested your time to have a serious conversation around the economics and policy issues that really matter in this country this morning. I think there was a little touch of perhaps pessimism around what the reform agenda might be post the election, and Alan Oster, I think, was a little bit gloomy about that and not really holding up a light as to what we might expect. And I think the challenge that I really wanted to leave you with, having invested 4 hours of your time today, is to actually say that's unacceptable. The thing that I think we all need to do is to invest in these policy conversations, to be interested in them, and to actually start expecting more of the particular policies that are implemented. We should be expecting that they are properly evaluated, that there is transparency about outcomes. There is a lot of money being spent on policies that are really, really important around innovation and technology, but they're all over the place at the moment. There's a dollop here, a dollop there, no strong national narrative. We're just going to nickel and dime that money away. They're subscale. That's just one example. We all have an interest in that. And I think we all have to become stronger in pushing for better policy and pushing for reform, because we cannot allow the next 8 years of this decade to go by without serious progress on climate change, without serious progress on human services, and without a serious commitment to this country becoming a leading digital and tech and innovative nation. And they're talked about, but we really, really need to bite the bullet after the election. That's what we at CEDA are trying to focus on. There are big choices to be made. You here are invested, the audience is invested in these issues. Please reach out and engage with us. Challenge us when we're not being brave enough, and tell us what you think we should be pushing, and come and work with us in doing that, whether it's through our policy and research agenda or coming along to the events that the programming team is working really hard to make sure are the right people on the right topics to have the grown-up conversations about this nation's future, which I think is really the challenge that we all have to rise to, and not just expect that someone else is going to lean in and do it. We're all about collaboration, and whether it's the CPD or other organisations or working with our members, that's where we want to be. So a little bit of a rally cry, I hope. Thank you for being here. I wanted to thank our sponsors, Torrens University and APIA, for continuing to support the work that we do. As I said, always nice to have new members who are seeing our purpose as important to them. We do have a bunch of events coming up that are right up there in terms of importance, with a number of premiers. I'm sure everyone's interested to hear from the New South Wales Premier, the Victorian Premier, and outgoing ACCC Chair Rod Sims. He's been vocal on a whole bunch of things. Competition policy sounds dry, but it is really critical to our future as well. So come along to those. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the audience who's joined us on the live stream. And can I say just a big thanks to my team. Quite a few of you have remarked on how nice it is to be in the room, and acknowledge that maybe we've been first out of the gate on that. My team's just done a fantastic job. They've just been hanging on by their fingernails in terms of programming and reprogramming and getting people to commit. And so I just wanted to thank them for that. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon.